Hello. Some of you will recall that about 10 days ago I posted a video on Catherine the Great. And I explained at that time that I was going to do two queens, Catherine the Great of Russia and Queen Isabella of Spain. And I explained why I wasn't going to deal with Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria. You all know enough about them. But I was basically complaining about this ongoing problem that I have with the women political leaders of today, and how I consider them not worthy. I find them that they imitate men a little bit too much, as if they were ashamed of their femininity. And I explained that I would cover these two women because they had to deal, one in Isabella in the 15th century, Catherine in the 18th century, with so many problems that they had to sort out in their countries, and how they went about it and so on. And I also, because there are two women at the periphery of women, one in Russia and one in Spain, and what they have in common, and so on. So I did explain that, and I posted a video on Catherine the Great, and I said that I was studying Isabella of Spain, and I would post another one soon. And it is ready. I did as much reading I can. I'm not going to do any more reading on it, and I'm ready to post the video on that. But I came across something that I'm going to use this as a prologue, as an introduction to Isabella. This is what happened. I wanted, just to finish off my studies here for the video, I wanted to go to one particular historian that I remember from my study days, studying history. And he's a Spanish historian. His name is Madariaga, and I will just introduce him quickly to you. He was professor. This is the beginning of the 20th century. He was professor here in Oxford, at the University of Oxford, for over 30 years. He was the Spanish voice at the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations in the 1920s, President Wilson and so on. And then he came to Oxford to teach here, and then he was recalled by the Spanish government to go as ambassador to Washington, and then to Paris, and then anyway he returned to Oxford, and he lived here for 30 years, and he lived in a little village. Well, it's not so little now, but it's right next to Oxford, but very close. You can actually walk it, and called Headington. And I was there. He was there until 1975, and I came up to Oxford in 1977. I missed him for just 2 years because of bad health, he went to Switzerland, and 4 years later he would die there in 1978. So I missed him for 2 years, not that I would have known him anyway. But so I was studying him, and I came across a lot. I read quite a bit of what he wrote about this subject of Spain and the Jews. And I came across a lecture that he gave in London in 1946. And the lecture was titled Spain and the Jews, and that is why the expulsion of the Jews, the Inquisition, all that. And it's a lecture on it, so it's not a book. He's not going to go into great detail. But what fascinated me was that, as I said, he gave this lecture in 1946, and he gave it to the Jewish Historical Society of England. And can you imagine in 1946 we had just learned at the end of the Second World War, practically, we had just learned of the Holocaust. Well, it had been going on, but I mean, we just discovered, actually the Russians were the first one who saw the ovens. Just to be fair, the Americans saw them afterwards. That's neither here nor there. But we just became aware of what had been going on. And he is giving this lecture to the Jewish Historical Society of England in 1946. Now you can imagine that the Spaniard, Spain, expulsion of the Jews, we've just learned about the Holocaust. To give a lecture, I thought, goodness gracious, that must have been difficult. I mean, what did he say and how did he say what he said? So I looked and looked. I was trying to find this lecture, and I finally found it actually printed. I had to get it from New York. It took a while, and I've spent some money in this. And it's a tiny little thing. It's a tiny little. It's a booklet. Okay, it's just a lecture. Do you see? And I will just give you the Lucien Wolf Memorial Lecture was instituted by the Jewish Historical Society of England in memory of Lucien Wolf, 1857-1930, one of its founders and 7 times its president. It is to be delivered. This was printed in 46, obviously. It is to be delivered annually by some person of eminence, Jewish or non-Jewish, and should deal with one of the subjects with which Lucien Wolf's interests were specifically associated. The 10th lectures of the series on Spain and the Jews was delivered on Thursday, May 23rd, 1946 by Don Salvador de Madariaga at University College, London. Mr. Charles E. Sebag-Montefiore, president of the Community of Spanish and Portuguese Jews in London, was in the chair. I think this is extremely important, and of course I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I will skip here and there. But I think in the days of today, what is happening and so on, that this is extremely important. And as I do not for a minute imagine that you're just going to rush off and try to find this lecture, I thought I should cover it as a testament to both the historian Madariaga and to the history of Spain. It's going to deal in very short form, you understand, but it's going to deal with everything, the history of the Jews in Spain, in the few examples that he gives. Of course, he's going to deal with the Inquisition and so on. So just as a testament, I think I should make a video on it. I hope I won't lose you halfway through it. But here it goes. It is not without diffidence that I accepted your invitation to speak on some theme which might interest your society. For, on the one hand, the outstanding competence of your members on matters of Jewish history ruled out every possibility of fresh contributions on the part of an outsider, such as I am. And, on the other, any discussion of things Jewish, whether of today or of the days of yore, thorny and forbidding at any time, is delicate in the extreme at the time when the Jewish people has just been cruelly and barbarously tried. In all that follows, I have borne in mind the sensitivity that the sad events of our epoch were bound to breed in all Jewish hearts. Loaded with tensions, heavy with memories, the history of the relations between the Jewish people and the Christian nations is one of the aspects of human life which challenge our impartiality with the most exacting weapons. Spaniards, however, are inured to this kind of situation, for the history of Spain has been for about 3 centuries one of the favorite grounds for fiction, misrepresentation, prejudice and bias, so that in this, at any rate, if not in other ways, a Spanish approach to Jewish history may afford the inestimable advantage of sympathy. Sympathy, yes, for scientifically and objectively built as the bricks of history must be, the historian is not a man of science, but predominantly an artist, and might be likened to an architect. Like an architect, he possesses a scientific training, yet he needs to be an artist at heart. In history, the mind may be good enough to hew the stones and bake the bricks we call facts, but without the heart and the intuition of the artist, no historical edifice can be built. It is the mind that reasons, but it is the heart that understands, a principle which might perhaps be proved to hold good even in pure mathematics, but which is unchallengeable in all that pertains to the knowledge of man, and most of all in history. It is in this light that we should interpret those pregnant words of Spinoza, the philosopher, or as we in Spain say, and as he himself said, for he was Spanish and Jewish, Espinosa, with an E and an S. Sedulo curavi humanas actiones non ridere, non lugere, neque detestari, sed intelligere. I check my my baccalaureate Latin, and I carefully took care not to laugh at human actions, nor to condemn them, nor to detest them, but to understand them. These words of a great mind, both Jewish and Spanish, should inspire all history, and in particular the history of our two peoples and their age-long relationship. But bearing in mind that, intent as he was on cleansing the mind of all those emotions which led shallow persons to ridicule, deplore, or execrate human actions, Spinoza knew full well that understanding is a cordial rather than a mental gift. Too long has our common history been obscured by the fumes of passion. Nor should we wonder at that, since both Jews and Spaniards are passionate peoples. By this passionate approach, though many a private heart may have found solace and comfort, history has been the loser in more ways than one. The bricks have often been defective, and the building has not risen to its full size. And to begin with, instead of emphasizing the elements of antagonism and of strife in the history of the two peoples, the true spirit of history must dwell on the often forgotten element of solidarity between Jew and Spaniard. Intertwined together by many centuries of common life, the Spaniards and the Jews dealt with each other on impulses, thoughts, traditions, many times reflected on their parallel souls. This continuous action and reaction of the two peoples on each other is the true historical fact, of which all the others are but symptoms, incidents, or episodes. It is the fact which makes the Jews so Spanish, Sephardic Jews at any rate, and keeps Jewry alive in Spain and Spain alive in Jewry, and makes of two of the peoples most stubbornly original the earth has known two collective characters so different and yet so alike in the history of man. This vigorous polarization is due above all to the most striking of the contrasts between the Jewish and the Spanish people. The Spaniard is deeply rooted in space, the Jew in time. The Spaniard is a son of the earth, the most directly earthbound of all Europeans. So earthbound, in fact, that his country is not his nation, nor his region, nor his province, but his village. The Spaniard springs from his soil like the trees and flowers of the corner of the earth in which he was born. Hence that rather than a Spaniard, he is a Basque, a Castilian, an Andalusian, and to all those who know Spain are aware, even the Andalusians, there are differences between the ones from Seville, from Granada, from Malaga, and from Cadiz. A difference which we could perhaps compare to the difference between Burgundy and Claret. No more striking contrast could be found with the Jew, faithful and loyal to himself despite the differences between them, never very deep, which his imitation faculties develop in him according to the nation in which he settles down. The very fact that the French Jew looks, speaks, thinks so much like any other Frenchman, and the English Jew looks, dresses, sounds, thinking so much like an Englishman, and so for all the others confirms the fundamental unity of them all. For the Jews have no roots in space. Their roots are in time. Their soil is made of 20 centuries of tradition. They differ from all the peoples of the earth in that their fatherland is history itself. May I dare here suggest that this, rather than persecution, segregation, or legislation, is the deepest cause of that urban trend of the Jew which leads him to seek commerce and the liberal professions rather than the land. Much has been written to provide sociological and historical reasons for the fact, and of course the weight of these reasons cannot be denied, but though they have contributed to develop the seed was there beforehand. Is it not a fact that the very word Hebrew comes from a stem meaning pilgrim, and is not therefore the phrase wandering Jew a pleonasm? Was not the lack of roots in space a feature of the Jews long before they were dispersed all over the earth by the fall of Jerusalem? And if so, would not a people committed to the seas and the roads more naturally incline to the cities, and to that mental and material commerce the cities foster, than to the tilling of the land, which tends to root and fix the crop gatherer as well as the crop? What people on earth conveys the impression that its life is a pilgrimage to the extent the Jewish people does? That land ever promise on an ever receding horizon, those seas beginning to cleave themselves so as to leave way for the wandering Jew, that longing which sets the Jew ever on the way, are they not symbols and dreams of a nation ever on the move? Yet not merely nomadic, but on the move with an aim and purpose. In these inner attributes, older than any diaspora or any persecution, the true explanation of the chief Jewish characteristics might well be found. This constancy in time, with this shiftedness in space, are they not the chief features of the mercurial type? The Jews are singularly gifted for all that is mercurial in life. Commerce, in all senses of the word, is their speciality. Exchange, in all senses of the word, is their favorite activity. Passing from one state to another and back again is the essence of all those forms of life, and no one is better fitted than the Jews for such swift changes. Their minds seem to possess a singular flexibility to adapt themselves to all sets of modes of thinking, so that they excel in expression and form. This explains their signal success as interpreters in all the senses of this word, from hotel porters to intellectual links between different civilizations, actors and masters of musical expression. Let us note in passing that the arts which need interpretation are the arts of time, music and poetry, and not the arts of space, sculpture and painting. And so we come again to that intimate association of the Jews with time, which is at the core of their destiny. Their outstanding gifts as interpreters are thus seen in their right perspective, not as a secondary quality in a people lacking more essential gifts, but as an essential gift in itself. It is necessary to dwell on this, for it is at times forgotten by the Jews. In order to persevere in time, despite the 1001 perils of space, the Jewish people had to develop a kind of spine of rigidity, their orthodoxy. From their biblical days, they have been the people of the book, and no other people or religion has ever surpassed them in their strict adherence to the tenets of their faith. This is the root virtue to which they owe their survival. It is also the root fault which has drawn on them many of their trials. Such is the people which in its early wanderings came upon Spain, settled there, and soon reached a close historical relationship with the Spaniards, the closest of all they have so far struck with any nation, with the possible exception of Germany. For all their admirable gifts of interpretation, it is to be deplored that the Jews have failed as interpreters of Spain. The reason for this failure is evident. The history of Spain was too intimately interwoven with their own history. As by a caprice of fate, the emperor who expelled them from Jerusalem was from Andalusia. That fastidious and over-refined Hadrian, who despised Jews and Christians alike as, he said, uncouth, superstitious Orientals, very much in need of physical and moral soap. That is what Emperor Hadrian thought. But lest we attempted to put on Hadrian's shoulders the responsibility for the Jewish wanderings, let us record that by the time he forbids the Jews to enter Jerusalem, there have been Jewish colonies in Spain for many centuries. The Jews were bound to find themselves at home in that country. For Spain, though Western by position, is Eastern by quality, as shown by the fact that he has raised to a high pitch of achievement no less than 3 Oriental peoples, the Jews, the Arabs, and the Gypsies. The Jews soon became a powerful factor in the life of Spain, in which Jewish names are prominent in every activity and at all times. During the 14 centuries which span the period between the fall of Jerusalem and the expulsion from Spain, the Jews contributed to the financial, commercial, industrial, political, juridical, scientific, historical and literary life of the country with a brilliancy higher than their mere numbers might lead one to expect. As for their relations with the other peoples and faiths of the land, their history is complex and bears but little resemblance to that of other countries. In the rest of medieval Europe, the Jews were infamously treated. In the Low Countries, they were considered as animaux brutaux and paid taxes at the city gates. It is a fact as curious as little known that when the Jews expelled from Spain in 1492 landed in Antwerp, they found that they had to accept baptism in order to be admitted. a condition under which, of course, they could have remained at home in Spain. England expelled them in 1290 and did not allow them back until the days of Cromwell, and even then somewhat surreptitiously. Germany kept them in constant terror and the threat of ever-recurring massacres. Sweden allowed them only in 2 small towns. France expelled them in 1306 and 1394. The Jews in Spain were by no means free from vexations and persecutions then, particularly at the beginning of the Visigothic era, and now and then under the rule of the Muslims in the south. Christian Spain was by no means above reproach either, but all in all the power, the wealth, the freedom and the prestige the Jews achieved in Christian Spain between the 10th and 15th centuries are without parallel in the history of Israel. This evolution begins quite early, for under Alfonso VI, the charters granted to the cities which this king conquered from the Moors and to those that helped him in his campaigns usually contained rights and even privileges in favor of the Jews. The Charter of Nájera, for example, in 1076, punished the murder of a Jew exactly as that of a monk or of a nobleman, while in other charters of the same period the Jews were put in matters of property on a footing of equality with the Christians, whether noble or plebeian. Alfonso's quartermaster general was a Jew. Under his banners, a Jewish contingent of no less than 40,000 men fought against the Moors in the Battle of Sacralias or Salaca, with black and yellow turbans, thousands of which covered the battlefield on that day, disastrous for the Christians and their gallant Jewish friends. The number of documents and anecdotes which illustrate the exceptional situation reached by the Jews in these early centuries of the Spanish Christian kingdoms is far too high for quotation otherwise than by some examples. More than once the Spanish monarchs were admonished by the Pope for their pro-Jewish policies. Gregory VII, for instance, after decreeing in a church council convened in Rome in 1078 that the Jews were not to be put in public offices where they would wield authority over Christians, he warned the King of Castile about it, yet with no result whatever, for the king did not remove any of the numerous Jews who held high office in his household or government. Nor was the Church excluded from the list of institutions which at one time or another fell under the authority of a Jew. In 1357 the bishop and charter of Córdoba Cathedral went before a royal court to claim exemption from an alleged obligation to provide food for a royal official. The bishop and chapter won their case against the royal household. But the interesting point was that the senior of the two magistrates who composed the court of or audiencia, the audience, was the royal treasurer, Don Samuel Levy, and the other one, a Christian, Velasco Garcia, who had not risen yet to a don. Here is a clear case of a Jew in a position of authority over a bishop and the chapter of a cathedral. The tradition of the Spanish kings, whether of Aragon, Catalonia or of Castile, was definitely pro-Jewish. One of the greatest of them, Ferdinand III, on taking Seville from the Moors in 1248, set aside for the Jews all the land nowadays occupied by 3 handsome cities. Finally granted them a considerable slice of the crown lands, including olive and fig tree groves and rich wheat lands. 3 villages were peopled with Jews who had come from other parts of Spain. The Jews of Córdoba wished to build a sumptuous synagogue under the same reign. Ferdinand III raised no objection, nor did the bishop, but the chapter of the cathedral appealed to the Pope, Innocent IV, who sent stiff orders to the bishop to prevent the continuation of the building. This papal bull acquired force of law, and in later years the Jews had to obtain a special privilege to build synagogues, mainly to avoid the erection of synagogues bigger than the main churches. But the royal attitude was clear. When Ferdinand III died in 1252, his son Alfonso X, the Wise or the Learned, inscribed on his sepulchre an epitaph in the 4 languages, Latin, Castilian, Arabic and Hebrew. In 1385, the Cortes, that is the Parliament, the Cortes met in Valladolid and requested the king to abrogate the privilege the Jews enjoyed, to the effect that the testimony of a Christian witness, even of good reputation, should not be valid in law against them in the absence of a Jewish witness. Another petition presented in the same Cortes asked that the Christians should be put on an equal footing with the Jews who, when found in possession of an object that had been stolen, for example, had the privilege not to be bound to explain how they had come by it, but only to deliver it on payment of what it had cost them, with regard to which they were to be believed on oath. The Jews had also the privilege to elect their own magistrates and be judged by them. Their communities were free, prosperous and well organized. Their worship not molested, save when a stern pope in Rome put pressure on the Spanish king. Their doctors and financiers moved in the highest circles of society. The great feudal lords and the kings entrusted their finances to the Jews. Jewish learned men acted as intellectual links between the East and the West, and twice at least under Alfonso VI and under Alfonso X, Toledo, the city, acted as a pivot of learning, mostly thanks to the collaboration of Jewish scholars. Well, so far the bright side of things. But the Jews, powerful, appreciated and protected by kings and lords, were not popular among the people. The reasons are complex. Envy was a widespread cause of anti-Jewish feeling. That lords and bishops should be rich and powerful was in the order of things, but that the Jews should be powerful was quite another matter, and one which did not seem natural. Of course, it could be explained, but few people accept things because and after they are explained. We only accept willingly that which requires no explanations. Those Jews, the people had seen them climb the whole ladder, from some humble trade to the silks and bright array of high office. More often than not, the ascent had been made by gathering taxes or farming them for a consideration. Too often also, the Jews practiced usury in the Catholic eyes, because of the high percent of interest, at rates unbelievable in our day. The records of the Cortes, the Parliament, and of the church councils are a storehouse of complaints on this short-sighted policy, whereby a relatively small number of Jews drew now and then upon their brethren the accumulated vengeance of generations of victims. The many pay for the few, None, however, of these motives would have been sufficient to set fire to the anti-Jewish passion of the people had there not been, between Christian and Jew, a feeling of distance, of difference, a sense that the Jew, though in Spain, was not a Spaniard. This sense was perhaps unjust in many cases. It was probably just in most. It was the obverse of that most admirable fidelity to himself and to his own people and tradition, which is the chief virtue of the Jew. This allegiance to Jerusalem inspires some of the poems written by the best Jewish poets of Spain. The greatest of them, Yehuda Halevi, for instance, sings, "My heart is in the east, and I at the end of the west. How could I enjoy the flavor of bread? How can I fulfill my vows and my promises when Zion lies oppressed by the Edomites and I live under the sway of the Arabs? I could without grief renounce all the beauty of Spain to behold the dust of the ruins of the temple." He quotes many of them, which are truly beautiful. These and many other poems on the same vein of the same poet and of others, such as the great Salomon ben Gabirol, show how the roots of the Promised Land still pulled at the heart of the Jews. They were in Spain, but not of Spain. This was the difference that worked for mutual estrangement, and not merely the difference in external ways, habits, even worship. This particular nature of the difference explains also that constant law of Spanish-Jewish relations. Anti-Jewish feeling was always a popular, seldom an aristocratic factor in Spanish history, for it is the people and not the individualized few who more acutely sense the differences in herd allegiance, and the Jews were of a different herd. We are safe in surmising that the people would have been the repository of anti-Jewish feeling in any case, but there was a historical reason which made it inevitable. The Jews were led by their separateness to make at least one serious mistake. They made the Moorish, the Arab conquest of Spain from 711 until 715 singularly easy by opening to the invaders the cities which they, the Jews, controlled, and by accepting to guard for the Moorish armies the cities already conquered. According to the German historian Gretz, they even conspired with the Jews of Africa to bring the Moors over into Spain. This is one of the cases which illustrate the constant action and reaction between Christians and Jews. The later Visigothic kings, about 4th century, had been generous and liberal towards the Jews, so that at first sight the behavior of the Jews in 711 has no excuse. But further back, under the Visigoths, the Jews had been treated harshly enough for them to remember the black through the rosy. This explains their attitude towards the Moors. In its turn, it explains that the Christians, returning southwards, massacred so many Jewish communities, setting fire to their synagogues and widening the gulf between the two peoples. A time came when the coexistence of an Arab Spain in the south and a Christian Spain in the north, with Jews in both, gave the Jewish people an opportunity to act as a link between the two. We know that they took it brilliantly in the realms of the mind, and that, mostly thanks to their talents, the science of the East and the culture of the Greeks were passed on to Europe. But some Jews took the opportunity in less reputable ways. Jewish merchants traveled north with rich cloth and Eastern jewelry, and they traveled south with Christian girls, whom they sold in the harems. This did not contribute to good feeling between Christians and Jews. It was one of the many ways in which the whole people were made to suffer for the sins of a few. The sum total of these and other similar factors produced a split society, with a tension between its two parts, and therefore at the mercy of any incident. Then, from nowhere in particular, the voice of hate would rise in the threatening air. The crowd would run wild, and the Jewish quarter would be sacked with much loss of life. The mad wave of anti-Semitism, which began in Germany in the 14th century and shook all Europe, determined in Spain a series of riots and massacres which began in Barcelona and Gerona. The movement spread like wildfire from 1391 on, owing to a fanatical priest, Don Ferran Martinez, who, defying the archbishop and the king, led the crowd against the Jews at Seville, killing many and looting their opulent quarters in that rich city. The consequences of these events were many and complex. Many Jews went into exile. Many sought safety in conversion. The Spanish nation received, so to speak, a blood transfusion which drove into her being a considerable element of Jewish life. This aspect of the matter may not have received as much attention as it deserved, for there are strong reasons for thinking that this driving in of Jewish blood into the veins and arteries of the Spanish body politic altered the Spanish character in the course of time. There was a second consequence of these mass conversions at the end of the 14th century. Between the Jew and the Christian, a new type emerged, the converted Jew, also known in Spain as New Christian or converso. The attitude of the Church and of the well-educated towards the Jew in those days was purely based on religion. Once christened, the Jew ceased to be a Jew. Conversos are often referred to in the documents as one who had been a Jew. That, however, in the nature of things, did not wipe out the past, and so the national palette, already variegated enough, took on a new colour. The quantity and the quality of the tensions increased. The monarchy, the state, and the church accepted the conversos with open arms. The great Rabbi Solomon Halevi, converted by St. Vincent Ferrer, and christened Pablo de Santa Maria. Remember this name, Santa Maria, because he's going to is going to be actually one of the main inquisitors and punish the conversos. But all right, so his name is christened Pablo de Santa Maria. His name was Solomon Halevi. Converted by St. Vincent Ferrer and christened Pablo de Santa Maria, he became Bishop of Burgos, tutor of Prince Don Juan, later Juan II of Castile, the father of the Queen Isabella, and he rose to be the Chancellor of the kingdom. He was by no means an exception. He was rather the symbol and example of the rule. As for the way the conversos accepted the state and the church, we could say that there are three main discriminated classes. One did sincerely become Christian and Spanish. This would appear to be the case of men such as Hernán Pérez del Pulgar, who was Queen Isabella's private secretary and chronicler. The second kind, as it would appear by far the most numerous, remained true to their faith under the Christian mask. Modern scholarship, whether Christian or Jewish, is unanimous on the staunchness of the loyalty of the conversos to their old faith, and so does but confirm what older observers hereafter quoted had set down. And finally, there was a third category of conversos who, not content with espousing the new faith, became themselves the most fiery enemies of the old. And in this third category, whose evil influence on Spain and her destinies cannot be exaggerated, a distinction should be made between those who turned against the unconverted Jews and those who, incredible as it may sound at first, took upon themselves to denounce also the very class of conversos to which they belonged. Before venturing into the unpleasant task of describing the tensions which resulted from this sinister net of differences, may I recall the signal services rendered to Spain and to the world by Spanish Jews, whether baptized or not. A catalogue, a summary even, would be here, if not out of place, certainly out of time. Two symbolic names may, however, be quoted, for they both spring to fame at about the time of the Expulsion. The first is Columbus, as prejudice still calls him Colón, as he himself chose to call himself. I have shown that the available facts about his life make no sense unless he sprang from a family of Spanish Jews who had settled in Genoa. And while your ex-president Dr. Roth has strengthened this conclusion with a scholarly remark on one of Colón's marginal notes, not a single argument of any weight has been brought forward on the other side. The field remains in the hands of those of us who believe that the great discoverer was a Spanish Jew. My second symbolic example will be less known to those who are not conversant with Spanish letters. Let me then say that the greatest work of Spanish literature after Don Quixote is without dispute the work of a converted Jew. It is called the tragicomedy of Callisto and Melibea, most inaccurately known in Spain under the short name of La Celestina, and even worse in English, the Spanish Board. She was a procuress of lovers, that kind of thing. And it's a tragic comedy, but it's very, very funny. Worth reading. Anyway, it is a novel in the form of a dialogue, written sometime between 1492 and 1500 by a Jewish lawyer, Fernando de Rojas. This novel springs with a complete modern spirit from among a still medieval world. It is the outcome of outstanding genius, in quality most like Shakespeare, though written 1 century earlier. These two men, Colón and Rojas, stand supreme as symbols and examples of the considerable wealth of spirit Spain owes to her Jews, both in the realm of inquiry and in that of letters and general thought. A people, however, cannot influence another with its gifts and qualities without acting on it also with its shortcomings and defects. The more so as these notions of gift and shortcoming, defect and quality are apt to shift and vary according to time, place, perspective and context. To many Jews and non-Jews, the idea that Spanish intolerance may well be, in part at least, of Jewish origin will no doubt sound paradoxical. What of the Inquisition? They would ask immediately. And if then the answer whether the Spanish Inquisition was, for a considerable part, a Jewish-inspired institution, the paradox would be complete. Let us then examine these 2 points. That intolerance was by no means a typical Spanish feature until the 15th century. That it was not a feature until the 15th century can be easily proved. I have already given a number of examples about relating to the Jews, but there is one more effective because it bears on the other faith, the Islam, far more feared than the Mosaic, and because it comes from epic poetry and therefore voices the general soul. All the highfalutin stuff about the duel between the cross and the crescent in Spain breaks down before the common sense of the poem of the Cid, written about 1140, a very short time after the death of the hero. In this poem, the motive of the struggle is constantly connected not with dogma, but with bread. Dozens of passages could be quoted. He quotes many, I will just read you one. The only zealot who declares he came all the way from his country to kill Moors is the French cleric Don Jerome, whom the Cid makes Bishop of Valencia. Quote, "That is why I left my country and came to meet you, for the desire I had to kill some more. I wanted to honor my order on my hands." And more to that effect, to which the Spanish hero with quiet humor retorts, "There you have Moors in plenty, go try your hand on them. From here we shall see how the abbot fights." He goes at great length over this, but then he asks, could this immensely popular poem have misrepresented an immensely popular hero? Obviously not. Could this hero be popular in a nation of dogmatic, intolerant bigots? Obviously not. The Spaniard of the years between 800 and 1400 was not intolerant. Not at any rate to the degree which later was to distinguish him. In those days, whatever intolerance there was came from one or other of the following sources: a foreign influence such as the Pope, the Cluny monks, and further back the Visigothic kings or bishops, or a national wave of popular fury mainly caused for reasons having nothing to do with religion, over which some zealot launch an irrelevant dogmatic issue. In every case, the outcome was relatively local and short-lived. Intolerance does not become either general or persistent until the 15th century. And it takes these 2 features from the Jews. I said features, I did not say defects. For what in fact the Jews bring to the Spanish character during that century when they begin to influence it deeply is a consistence and a persistence it had not possessed before. The Spanish people rooted in space rise from the earth vertically. They lack uniformity at any given time and persistence along the line of time. They could not have maintained a general and constant rule of policy as they did later for centuries without the help of the people rooted in time, which flows everywhere the same and ever faithful to its line of flow. We know from the history of the Jews that this persistence of the flow did not prevent at times the splitting of the Jewish river into rival branches, which destroyed each other with singular ferocity. The Spaniard stood in no need of any Jew as to ferocity or civil war, but despite time-honored ideas, he did perhaps borrow from the Jew a dogmatic motivation for them, and certainly the persistence needed to maintain strong institutions to that effect. This is not the place to describe in detail the birth of the Inquisition. For our purpose it is enough to recall that it owed its existence mainly to a persistent anti-Jewish campaign carried out by preachers and writers, both in the kingdoms of Castile and of Aragon, many of them of Jewish extraction. The list of anti-Jewish treatises written by Jewish Christians in the 15th century is long. The leaders of the movement were in Castile Don Pablo de Santa Maria and Alonso de Espina. Both were conversos. In Aragon, Jerónimo de Santa Fe and Pedro de la Caballeria. Santa Fe and Caballeria, the old, the four of them were Jews. It would be difficult, these were the ones who started, the Inquisition. It would be difficult to find in the history of anti-Semitism a more sinister figure than that Father Espina, who was the confessor of Henry IV of Castile, and he was also the rector of the University of Salamanca. For it was under him that whatever anti-Semitism Santa Maria had fostered already was deflected, and then it changed from religion to race. Santa Maria had denounced the, quote, faithless Jews. Espina thundered against his own brother conversos, and the first time the flames of the Inquisition were set ablaze in Spain, it was in a fiery sentence of his, in which he uses the word Inquisition still in its original sense of inquiry or investigation. And he said, quote, I believe, wrote Espina, that if in this our time a true Inquisition were undertaken, innumerable would be those who would have to be delivered over to the flames among those found to be secret Jews, who, if they are not here more cruelly punished than the public Jews, shall be burnt in eternal fire. End of quote. The persistence of these and other conversos to establish an Inquisition conquered all obstacles, formidable as they were. The nobility and the crown were against the Inquisition. Mendoza, the Archbishop of Toledo, also. Two forces helped those who had taken the lead. One was the popularity of the idea among the people. The other was that the charge Espina and his anti-Jewish disciples level against the conversos was substantially true. In general, they all dissembled. The Inquisition was founded, but not against the Jews, not even against the conversos. It was founded against the conversos who were discovered to be Jews. For 14 years still the Jew was free to worship in his own way openly. What he was not free to do was to worship secretly after he had been baptized. and that is what the people hated. Anyway, curiously enough, the most outspoken, would you believe, though unwitting defense of both the Inquisition and the Expulsion, not that he was referring to it, but unwittingly, is to be found in Rousseau's Contrat Social, the social contract. Here's a quote. It's to express the times, as it were. Quote, "There is a profession of purely civic faith, the articles thereof it is for the sovereign to determine. He can force no one to believe in them, but can exile all those who do not. And should anyone, after publicly acknowledging these dogmas, behave as if he did not believe in them, let him be punished by death. He has committed the worst of crimes. He has lied before the laws." As end of quote. And that is Rousseau. Times have changed. But this was the idea at the time anyway. It does not seem, therefore, that the conversos had much of a case against the Inquisition. The matter is, however, not so simple, for, to begin with, the mass of crypto-Jews to be found in Spain in the 15th century was due to the wave of anti-Jewish violence which had run through the country at the close of the 14th century. So that here again, the action and reaction of Christian on Jew and Jew on Christian is difficult to disentangle. Moreover, whatever the theoretical merits of the position, the practice of the Holy Office was at the beginning harsh in the extreme. Here again, the facts are facts. The worst period of the Inquisition is that covering the terms of office of the two first inquisitors. And that was not Torquemada, that he came later. This was due above all to the fact that they had to bear the brunt of the first impact with the evil the Inquisition was meant to cure, the widespread development of secret worship of, quote, the law of Moses. But there were other reasons. In the case of Torquemada, his rigid, dogmatic and persistent nature, true to one aspect of the Jewish religious psychology, and in that of Detha, another one, a worldly ambition which led him to swim with the stream. In the first case, it led to strict, indeed terrible, but pure and lofty application of the new law. In the second, to an indolent toleration of scandalous abuses, such as those of the criminal and corrupt Lucero. The outcry in the city of Córdoba, where he operated, was clamorous. Detha was deaf to all complaints, but in the end he himself was dismissed. His successor was the great Jiménez de Cisneros, of whom this much may be said, that he carried out a wholesale destruction of Arabic books by fire, but carefully promoted the study of Hebrew and the advancement of learning in the University of Alcalá in Madrid, which he founded and endowed. Cisneros was an enlightened man, if strictly orthodox, and an ascete. No one can doubt either of the pure and indeed ascetic character of the Queen Isabel. Ferdinand was more of what we would call today a realist, in the bad as well as the good sense of the term. But no man, both straight and well-informed, can raise against Ferdinand or Isabella the reproach of anti-Semitism. Their household abounded in Jews, both converted and unconverted, and their most intimate advisers and friends were of Jewish extraction. Isabel's 3 private secretaries, Ferdinand's 5 ministers, some of his most important military and naval commanders, his chief steward and executor of his will, were all of Jewish blood. The Inquisition made no difference. The expulsion made no difference. When a conspiracy of Jews led to the murder of Pedro Arbues, the Inquisitor of Aragon, and the burning at the stake of the converso Luis de Santangel, in whose house the murder had been planned, Ferdinand, whose financial secretary was another Luis de Santangel, first cousin of the man burnt at the stake, did not budge. His financial secretary remained in office. 4 years later, in 1491, he was accused by the Inquisition and mildly condemned. Ferdinand kept him in office. 1 year later, Luis de Santangel, Ferdinand lent the crown 16,000 ducats to finance Columbus. On Colon's success, Santangel was promoted to the Royal Council. All these facts show that Ferdinand and Isabella suffered no racial prejudice. Their problem was purely religious and political. They lived in an epoch in which the idea that a nation could be formed out of men of different faiths was incomprehensible. Even the staunchest advocates of the conversos and opponents of the Inquisition had warned the king and queen against the danger to the neophytes of maintaining intercourse with the Jews. This danger led to the expulsion of the Jews from Andalusia in 1478. The Cortes of Toledo in 1480 laid down that within 2 years the Jews were to be segregated into separate quarters in all the cities of Castile. Many cities of Aragon and Catalonia, though not bound by these laws, adopted them on their own and made them even stricter. There are reasons for thinking that Queen Isabel had come to the view that expulsion would be inevitable as early as 1478. The Edict of 1492, that is when they were officially expelled, was an act of dictatorship on the part of the king and queen. It went beyond the powers of the crown. It was a violation of a number of rights traditionally recognized or recently granted to the Jews. It evinced a monstrous ingratitude with regard to some powerful and able Jews such as Abarbanel and Abraham Senior, whose collaboration in the Granada campaign had been invaluable. But it was popular and, in the circumstances, inevitable. No other European monarch facing the same circumstances would have acted otherwise. Some would perhaps have acted worse. The combined effect of the Inquisition and the expulsion was of the utmost complexity. It is, for instance, doubtful whether it acted to make Spain less Jewish. The wiser view is that it increased Jewish influence on Spain by driving it underground and making it more intense. I have already pointed out elsewhere that Andrés Bernaldez, a simple, kindly, though anti-Jewish priest, who wrote the Chronicle of Ferdinand and Isabella, accuses the Jews, among other terrible crimes, of cooking their meat in oil. But considering that today, 4.5 centuries after the expulsion, the whole of Spain does so, it would appear that, at least in cookery, no negligible index, Spain is gone Jewish. I do not say remained, I said gone. For obviously, in Bernaldez's days, Christian Spain did not cook its meat in olive oil. The numbers and power of the Jews that remained in Spain were great, despite the Inquisition, and most of them unconverted, despite appearances. Blas Gonzalo de Rivero, writing under Philip IV, with over a century and a half of Inquisition behind him, said, quote, "The descendants of this lineage have no limit as to the hardness and pertinacity of their faith, as shown in Portugal, Castile, and other parts, where though 6 or 7 generations have run since the conversion of their ancestors, they have not yet forgotten the lore of their sires." This is more than confirmed by the exile Sephardi Pinto in his letters to Voltaire. I will be translating badly from the French, but here it is. The Christian theologians will never be able to convert one single man of this religion. We can see, it is true, excuse me, some Jews pretending to recant, to abjure, sometimes through avarice and sometimes because of terror. This Sephardi Jew, Pinto. But nobody has ever embraced Christianity in good faith. Orobio speaks of some rabbis, Arabs and Spaniards, who abjured and became bishops in Spain. But what he doesn't say is that they never renounce their faith, their religion in good faith. All right. Pinto exaggerates, but not too much. This fidelity, even hidden to the Mosaic law, was then extremely dangerous in Spain, and the truly heroic stand some of the secret Jews made when found out led in some cases to sensational conversions of Christians to the Jewish faith, immediately followed by death at the stake. The records of the Inquisition and such scholarly studies as Professor Bataillon, Erasmus and Spain prove that many of these secret Jews or more or less sincere conversos were upright, sometimes austere, sometimes elegant and cultivated minds. Their very brilliancy was often a signal to the envious. The history of the 16th and 17th centuries is full of eminent names who suffered from mild mockery to inquisitorial torture for their Jewish blood. For it soon came to that. Góngora, he mentions quite a few Spanish writers. Beyond the Inquisition and the expulsion of the old motive of envy had remained, as well as that curious and constant feature of Spanish anti-Semitism, its popularity with the people. The first man of humble origin to occupy the See of Toledo, Cardinal Silicio, is the author of the Statute of Toledo of 1547, excluding from all offices of his diocese all those who were not old Christians. Despite the opposition of the clergy of noble extraction, most of whom had some Jewish quarter tucked away somewhere in their coats of arms, the statute was finally adopted by all the churches of Spain, and a search for clean blood became the favorite and lucrative occupation of genealogists. In 1560, Cardinal Mendoza, offended because the Council of the Orders wished to look closely into his nephew's blood before granting him an order, put before the king his famous Tizón de España, that's the tar brush of Spain, so to speak, showing that the whole Spanish nobility had some Jewish blood. This would not disquiet Philip II, whose secretary and chronicler Cabrera was of Jewish blood, too. Philip II of the Spanish Armada, you recall. As for the expelled Jews, they remained attached to Spain by a tension due precisely to the fact that it was in Spain they had been able to attain the strongest position of all. They left Spain very Jewish. They went away very Spanish. On that account they felt themselves to be the aristocracy of all Jewry. Writes the historian Gretz, wherever they went, they founded Spanish or Portuguese colonies. They carried the Spanish tongue, Spanish dignity and distinction to Africa, Syria and Palestine, Italy and Flanders. They cherished and cultivated these Spanish manners so lovingly that it has maintained itself to this day in full vigour among their descendants. Far from being absorbed in the majority of the Jewish populations in countries which had hospitably received them, they, as a privileged race, looked down upon them with contempt, and not unfrequently dictated laws to them. This arose from the fact that the Spanish and Portuguese Jews spoke the languages of their native countries, which by the discoveries and conquest of the 16th century had become the languages of the world. And they spoke them with purity, took part in literature, and thereby, even when conferring with Christians, could do so on equal terms with manliness and without any fear or servility. This is borne out by Isaac Pinto, who in his letters to Voltaire protests that Voltaire's strictness against the Jews only applies to the Ashkenazis, not to the Sephardis, and urges him to distinguish, again translating, to distinguish them from the other Jews, the Spanish and Portuguese, who should never be confused with the crowd of Jacob's other children. Their divorce with their other brothers had reached the point that if one, for example, one Spanish or Portuguese a Jew in Holland or in England married a German Jewish woman, he would immediately lose his prerogatives, and he would not be recognized by the members of their synagogue. He would be separated of the body of the nation. That is what Pinto wrote to Voltaire. We recognize here, working as between Jew and Jew, that rigid orthodoxy is still discernible in some Jewish communities of our day towards the liberal or unorthodox Jew who marries a Christian. The attitude of the exiled Sephardis towards Spain was, so to speak, bipolar. Their fidelity to the old country has often been exaggerated and sentimentalized, and even their retention of, let's see if I can, my goodness, their retention of the language through the centuries may have been more utilitarian than meets the eye. In a rare travel to the Holy Land, published by a Spanish friar in 1598, we read that, I'm quoting, "All the Jews of the Levant speak Castilian, and in Tripoli I asked a rabbi why, and he answered it was not because of the quality of the language, but because of its secrecy. Because the Turks knew Hebrew, Chaldean, Italian, and Greek, but did not understand Spanish." Nevertheless, as Pinto's letters show, there was a certain pride in it, and to this day, in 1946, except on the trail of devastation left by the Germans, Sephardis can be found to speak their Spanish for pride more than for profit. The other pole was a natural and tenacious resentment, the bigger for the power and prestige the Jews had enjoyed in Spain. This gave place to an ubiquitous activity against the Spanish Empire, carried out on the religious side from the Spanish Jews of the Netherlands, and on the political and military side from Spanish Jews in England. A subject that Dr. Roth has already illustrated from this tribune. The importance of the Jewish families of Perez and Mendez in the spreading of Calvinism could hardly be exaggerated. The fact should be, moreover, realized that despite severe prohibitions, there were many Jews in both Spain and the Indies. Thus, after Essex's attack on Cadiz, the list of Flemish merchants settled in Cadiz, whom he took back to England as hostages, seeing he did not get the 120,000 ducats he wanted, included one Enrique Bernal and one William Enriquez, Guillermo Enriquez, his wife and children. There is a telling detail. The last was said to have sailed on his own accord, which may be connected with the fact that Essex's fleet had friends in the harbour who signalled information to it. Jewish names abound also round Miralda, Bolivar, and the other emancipators of the Spanish-American kingdoms. When George Borrow visited Spain, the Prime Minister was a Jew. This is in the 19th century. He has left a striking description of Mendizábal, certainly as able a statement as governed Spain this many a generation. Anyway, let us conclude, because now he goes now to the 20th century, talks about the Spanish government and so on. Let me just conclude. Oh, perhaps the 19th and 20th centuries have been for Spain an era of political struggle and economic rebirth. On its political side, it has gradually opened the gates of the country to all peaceful newcomers, and under the different names of freedom of worship or tolerance, gradually slackened the ties of the old orthodoxy. On the economic side, it is significant that Jews, both Sephardi, like the Pereira family, and Northern, like the Rothschild, have taken a powerful share in Spain's modern development. There are signs that Spain thinks more of her Jews than her Jews of Spain. Primo de Rivera was a Spanish dictator in the 1920s, before Franco. Primo de Rivera began by easing the path of nationalization for all Jews of Spanish origin, and the Republican Constitution made it easier still. Had the Republic lived, Toledo might have become again a center of Hebrew studies. I understand that the present regime, that's the Franco regime, has set up in Madrid a school of Hebraic studies which publishes a review, Sepharad. But there is no clear indication that even under the Republic, the Sephardi Jews had responded eagerly to these advances. So to conclude, what are we to make of this melancholy history? Nothing at all but nonsense and bad temper if we do not realize that outside the exact sciences, to prove something wrong is not to prove his adversary right. The Spanish-Jewish tension grew out of circumstances which made it impossible for either a Spaniard or Jew to provide reasonable solutions. Strife and cooperation in a long-drawn historical rhythm led to an interchange of gifts, qualities and defects, which made Spain one of the most Jewish countries in the world, and of the Spanish Jews universal conveyors of Spanish ways. If the past be contemplated with historical detachment, there is nothing to prevent Spain and her Jews from cooperating mutually to organize the Spanish-speaking world within the new order of world affairs under the guidance of reason, and so that again, in the words of Spinoza, this Hispanic world may persevere in its own being. Well, that is his address to the Jewish Historical Society of London, and I thought it a good idea to read this to you as a preamble to the, as I said, to the video I shall be posting on the Queen herself, Queen Isabel of Spain. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.